when I wrote my first book, I wrote it over about I guess I started it really in 1984 and I finished it in 1999, so 15 years. And I wrote pretty much 3 hours a day, every day. And I thought about what was in that book manically, I would say, hypomanically anyways, for at least 12 of those years. So I was just thinking about it all the time. Well, not all the time. I was doing some research in other areas at the time, but that all tied into it. So pretty much all the time. And I was obsessed with the Auschwitz phenomenon, I would say. Is obsessed with atrocity, but psychologically, right? Not economically, not sociologically. None of that, I thought. Trusty Auschwitz guard committing atrocity. There's one famous story that I came across. I think it was in Man's Search for Meaning, Frankel, but it might not have been. So, the people who came to the concentration camps who were transported, they were transported in cattle cars essentially, and many of them in the winter froze to death if they were on the outside of the cattle car, or were suffocated in the middle. And they were separated from their families, and there were people of different nationalities and different language families all crammed together, so they were as alienated and broken as people could possibly be. And you'd think that'd be enough, really, wouldn't you? But no. You come to the camp, and the people in the cars would cheer if they came to a camp that had no chimney. And so that shows you what joy is like under those conditions. So one of the tricks that the guards used to play in Auschwitz was they'd get these people after this brutal transport to pick up like 100-pound sack of wet salt and carry it from one side of the compound to the other and back. And compound, that's not like an area this size. Those places were small cities. They had 50,000 people in them, some of the camps. So it was a walk across town after you'd been separated from your family and just about froze to death and were 3/4 dead and had everything stripped away. It's like, just who the hell did you have to be to then subject that person to work for no other reason than to prolong their suffering, right? Because Solzhenitsyn said, when he was in the camps, that at least if he was laying bricks in a wall, or a bricklayer was doing so, at least he had the satisfaction of building something, right? There was some tiny iota of meaning in the work, something redemptive in that, a crumb that you could feast on in the midst of your starvation. But whoever came up with this particular torment figured out how to make work itself counterproductive, right? Work itself nothing but a means to more suffering. And you remember the joke on the outside of the Auschwitz camp, work will set you free. Someone made a joke about that. I wanted to think about just exactly what would you have to be like to make that joke. And part of the reason I wanted to figure that out is because I'm a human being, and a human being made that joke. And a human being forced that punishment onto someone who was already suffering. And I wanted to figure out what you would have to be like, what I would have to be like to do that. I thought if I could figure that out, then I could figure out what the opposite of that was, right? Because maybe such things should be brought to a halt. That's what we were supposed to remember from the concentration camps, which we're continually reminded never to forget as well. You do not remember what you cannot understand. And so we think, well, evil people did this, and hey man, fair enough, But don't be so sure that those people aren't you. And so that's a horrible thing to contemplate, but a necessary thing to contemplate. And I would say also that if you don't contemplate it, you end up placing that great evil somewhere else, right? In some other person, in some other race, in some other political party. That's going somewhere. And if it's not part of your own heart and the fight isn't there, well, you're going to have the fight somewhere. So I thought about that for a long time, and then what I concluded was that the way out of that is to make better people at the individual level. It's a psychological issue, fundamentally, not a sociological issue, not an economic issue, certainly not an economic issue, not a political issue. It is all those things to some degree, not fundamentally. There's no political reason to have some suffering person under your dominion carry a sack of wet salt that weighs 100 pounds from one side of a compound to another. No, that's you, man, corrupt right to hell. And so, you think that's pretty terrible, and it is pretty terrible, but there is one advantage to specifying evil in a very distinctive and precise manner, is that when you specify something that precisely, you also specify its opposite, right? So if there's evil of that depth, then, there, at least in principle, might be the opposite of that, which would be the force that might resist it. And so while I was looking into the heart of darkness, let's say, the light started to shine through. And, partly when I started to understand, it was a little bit before that you should not lie. That's a big mistake. You think you can, first of all, I'll tell you one thing, that I never saw any of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, ever. We track their misery back to its origination point, and sometimes it was a mistake on their part, often a moral error, which they knew was a moral error when they were committing it, but may have forgotten about afterwards, so it became unconscious in some sense, or habitual, or it was a moral error that someone else, that they were beholden to, a lie on the part of their mother or father, someone they were tangled up with, someone malevolent. But yeah, the pigeons come home to roost, man, and how could it be otherwise? You really think you have the capacity to bend the structure of reality without it eventually snapping back and hitting you in the face? Like, how arrogant can you possibly be to think that? And so, I came to believe that truth in particular, spoken truth, but not only spoken truth, was the antidote to that evil and to that suffering, really, truly the antidote to that. It's more complex than that, but that's something. And I also came to believe that each of us have far more under our dominion in terms of the destiny of the world, let's say, than we would ever even care to dare to dread, let's say. I don't know how it works, but each of us, we make decisions between heaven and hell all the time. With every decision, in fact. With every decision. That's a decision, up or down. And in some manner, the whole collective enterprise is guided by those individual decisions. And it's not washed away in the mix, it's somehow not just your trivial action in a sea of 7 billion random actions. We're networked, and our actions echo, and what we do or don't do, or what we do deceitfully, has ramifications far beyond what we can immediately see, or often are willing to immediately see. It's like, the only more frightening realization than nothing you do matters is the realization that everything you do matters. It's like you want to pick an existential terror. You think meaninglessness is terrifying. You try its opposite, and you'll see how terrifying that is. But it's a terror. It's a holy terror, right? It's a terror that sustains and ennobles And every single person knows that that is true, knows that you're fleeing from your destiny by avoidance of the necessary responsibility that your conscience calls you towards. And we toy with it because we can, and we try to avoid it because we test, we're immature, and we're bitter often, and it's not surprising because people suffer dreadfully, and it's very difficult to suffer. Suffer dreadfully without becoming bitter, but it doesn't help. All it does is make the suffering worse and spreads it. And if the suffering is morally objectionable, spreading it is hardly going to rectify that. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic about our possibilities because I think we can do anything we set our minds to. And so, hopefully, we'll set our minds to the proper things. And every single one of you have to make that decision.